There are moments in a soldier's life when duty becomes something far heavier than the rifle in your hands or the oath you swore. Moments when the line between loyalty and truth becomes so razor-thin that one wrong step could destroy everything you've built, everything you believe in, everything you are. This is the story of one such moment. A story about a royal guard who stood at that line, stared into the abyss of power and deception, and made a choice that would shake the very foundations of the crown he swore to protect. What he found behind the gilded doors of privilege would challenge everything he thought he knew about honor, duty, and the people he served. This is not just a story about missing jewels. This is a story about what happens when the guardians of the realm discover that the greatest threat to the crown might come from within its own walls. His name was Captain James Aldridge, and for 17 years he had served in the Queen's Royal Guard with a record so impeccable it was almost boring. No scandals, no controversies, no moments of weakness, just pure, unwavering service to the crown and country. He was the kind of soldier other soldiers pointed to when they talked about what it meant to be a guardsman. 42 years old, salt and pepper hair cropped military short, a face carved from discipline and early morning runs in the rain. He had the kind of eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing, the kind of posture that made civilians straighten their spines when he walked past. He didn't just wear the uniform. He embodied it, every button polished to mirror shine, every movement precise and purposeful, every word measured and deliberate. In a world of compromise and convenience, Captain Aldridge was something increasingly rare, a true believer. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. The kind of morning where autumn mist hung low over the palace grounds and the world felt hushed, reverent, like nature itself was standing at attention. Captain Aldridge was in his office, a modest room in the east wing that smelled of old leather and furniture polish, when the knock came. 3 precise raps: military, professional. He looked up from the deployment schedule he'd been reviewing and called out for whoever it was to enter. The door opened and Colonel Marcus Thornfield stepped inside, closing it carefully behind him. Thornfield was the head of Royal Security, a man who'd spent 30 years navigating the treacherous waters between military duty and political reality. He was good at his job precisely because he understood that protecting the royal family meant protecting them from threats that didn't always come with guns and bombs. Sometimes the threats wore silk gowns and spoke with cultured accents. Thornfield didn't sit down. He stood in front of Aldridge's desk with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral in that way that immediately told Aldridge this wasn't a routine visit. There was a heaviness in the room, a weight that pressed down on both men. Thornfield spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper despite the closed door and the thick walls. He told Aldridge that there was a situation, a delicate situation, a situation that required someone with impeccable judgment, absolute discretion, and the kind of integrity that couldn't be compromised or intimidated. He told him that the crown jewel keeper had discovered discrepancies in the royal collection. Not the big pieces, not the crown jewels that everyone knew about, but smaller items, historical pieces, personal jewelry that had belonged to the late Queen Mother, pieces that should have been catalogued, inventoried, and secured in the royal vault, pieces that were missing. Aldridge felt something cold settle in his stomach. In 17 years of service, he'd dealt with terrorist threats, assassination attempts, security breaches, and diplomatic nightmares. But this was different. This was internal. This was family. Thornfield continued, his voice even quieter now. The investigation had been discreet, he said. Very discreet. They'd checked and rechecked the records. They'd interviewed the vault keepers, the security staff, everyone who had access. And slowly, carefully, following a trail of signatures and movement logs and security footage, they'd traced the jewelry to one location, the private estate of the Duchess of Ashworth, the king's second wife, the woman who had married into the family just 3 years ago and had been working tirelessly to establish herself as a respected member of the royal household. The silence that followed was absolute. Aldridge understood immediately why Thornfield had come to him. This wasn't just about missing jewelry. This was about the future of the monarchy. This was about trust and legitimacy, and the delicate balance that kept the entire institution standing. If this was handled wrong, if word leaked out, if the accusation proved false, or if it proved true but became public, the damage would be catastrophic. The press would feast on it for months. The public would demand answers. The king would be forced to choose between his wife and his crown. Everything would burn. Thornfield needed someone who could investigate this properly, thoroughly, and completely off the books until they knew exactly what they were dealing with. Aldridge asked the obvious question. What evidence did they have that the jewelry was at the Duchess's estate? Thornfield pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the desk. Inside were photographs, security logs, movement records, a pattern that was impossible to ignore. 3 separate pieces of the late Queen Mother's personal collection had been signed out of the vault for cleaning and restoration over the past 18 months. Each time, the authorization had come from the Duchess's office. Each time, the pieces had been transported to a private restoration specialist who operated out of a workshop near the Duchess's country estate. And each time, the pieces had never been returned to the vault. The paperwork said they had been. The signatures were in order. But when the crown jewel keeper had actually gone to physically verify the inventory, the pieces weren't there. They were gone. But here was the interesting part, Thornfield said, his eyes fixed on Aldridge's face. The restoration specialist they'd supposedly been sent to didn't exist. The business was registered, yes. It had a website and a phone number and an address. But when investigators had visited the location, they'd found an empty workshop that hadn't been used in over a year. The phone number went to a voicemail that was never returned. The website hadn't been updated since it was created. It was a shell, a front. Someone had created an entire fake business just to provide plausible documentation for removing valuable historical pieces from the royal vault. And all the paperwork, all the authorizations, all the movement orders, they all led back to one source: the Duchess of Ashworth's office. Aldridge studied the documents in silence. His mind was already working through the implications, the possibilities, the angles. This could be a theft, yes. But it could also be something else. A setup, a frame job. Palace politics were vicious, and there were plenty of people who would benefit from seeing the Duchess disgraced. The old guard who resented her modern approach to royal duties. The tabloid press who had never fully accepted her. Even members of the extended royal family who felt she'd risen too high too fast. Someone could have used her office, forged her authorization, created this entire trail of evidence to destroy her. Or it could be exactly what it looked like. A woman who'd married into unimaginable wealth and decided to help herself to pieces she thought no one would miss. Pieces that could be quietly sold to private collectors for millions of pounds. Pieces that represented not just monetary value but centuries of history, legacy, and tradition. Thornfield told him that he had authorization to conduct a search of the Duchess's private estate. Not the official residence in London, but her personal property in the countryside. A manor house she'd owned before marrying into the royal family. A place she still retreated to for privacy and solitude. The legal authorization was solid, reviewed by the Crown solicitors. But it had to be executed carefully. No press, no publicity, no advance warning. Aldridge would take a small team, no more than 4 people, all trusted veterans who understood the sensitivity of the operation. They would go in early morning before staff arrived, and they would conduct a thorough but respectful search. If they found nothing, they would leave no trace of their presence. If they found the jewelry, they would secure it, document everything, and report back. After that, the decisions would be made at levels far above Aldridge's pay grade. Captain Aldridge looked at the folder on his desk, then back at Colonel Thornfield. He asked one more question. Does the king know? Thornfield's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. The king has been briefed on the discrepancies in the royal collection, he said carefully. He has authorized a thorough investigation, but specific operational details are being handled by security staff to maintain the integrity of the investigation, which meant Aldridge understood that the king knew jewelry was missing, but didn't know his wife was the prime suspect. Not yet. Not until they had proof one way or the other. plausible deniability, protection from having to act on suspicion rather than evidence. It was smart. It was also the loneliest thing Aldridge could imagine, having your security staff investigate your own wife without your full knowledge. He accepted the assignment, not because he wanted it, not because he was ambitious or looking to make a name for himself, but because someone had to do it and it needed to be done right. If the Duchess was innocent, he would prove it and clear her name. If she was guilty, he would gather the evidence the Crown needed to deal with it properly. Either way, the truth mattered more than comfort or convenience. That's what he told himself as he assembled his team. That's what he told himself during the 2 days of careful planning that followed. That's what he told himself at 4:30 in the morning when he climbed into the unmarked vehicle that would take them to the Duchess's estate. The truth mattered. Honor demanded it. Duty required it. The drive took 90 minutes through countryside that was just beginning to wake up. Fields shrouded in mist, small villages with dark windows, the occasional fox darting across the road in the pre-dawn darkness. Aldridge sat in the passenger seat reviewing the estate layout one more time. It was a substantial property. A Georgian manor house set on 40 acres of parkland with gardens, a small lake, and various outbuildings. The Duchess had inherited it from her grandmother and had spent considerable money restoring it to its former glory. She was known to spend long weekends there, especially when she needed a break from the scrutiny of London life. According to their intelligence, she wasn't currently in residence. She was attending a charity function in Scotland and wouldn't return for 3 more days. The estate was staffed with a skeleton crew, a groundskeeper who lived in the cottage by the main gate, a housekeeper who came daily but didn't arrive until 8 o'clock. Security was minimal, because the Duchess valued her privacy and hated feeling like she was under constant surveillance. They arrived at 6 o'clock just as the sky was turning from black to deep blue. The groundskeeper let them through the gate without question. He'd been told that security personnel would be conducting a routine inspection. Nothing to worry about, just protocol. They parked in the circular drive in front of the main house, and Aldridge felt that familiar tightening in his chest that came before any operation, that heightened awareness, that sense that he was stepping across a threshold into something that couldn't be undone. He looked at his team. Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in forensic documentation who could process a scene with surgical precision. Lieutenant David Chen, a veteran investigator who'd worked with Scotland Yard before joining the Royal Guard. Corporal Thomas Webb, their security specialist who would monitor communications and ensure they weren't interrupted. All of them professionals. All of them understanding exactly what was at stake. The house key had been provided by palace administration. Legal, authorized, documented. But Aldridge still felt like an intruder as he unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the entrance hall. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from someone with the Duchess's background. Elegant, but not ostentatious. Beautiful antique furniture mixed with comfortable modern pieces. Original artwork on the walls. Fresh flowers in vases even though the owner was away. The kind of home that spoke of old money and good taste. They moved through the rooms methodically, carefully respecting the space even as they searched it. The morning light was starting to filter through the tall windows, casting long shadows across polished floors. They found nothing in the public rooms, nothing in the kitchen or the dining room or the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, nothing in the conservatory or the morning room or the parlor with the grand piano. They moved upstairs, checking bedrooms and bathrooms and storage closets. Still nothing. Aldridge could feel time pressing on them. The housekeeper would arrive in less than 2 hours. They needed to finish and be gone before then, leaving no trace of their presence. He was starting to think they'd been wrong, that the evidence had led them to a dead end, that maybe this had all been an elaborate misdirection, and the real thief was somewhere else entirely, laughing at how they'd wasted time and resources chasing shadows. Then Lieutenant Chen called out from the Duchess's private study. His voice was quiet but urgent. "Captain, you need to see this." Aldridge crossed the landing and entered the study, a wood-paneled room with a massive desk and walls lined with leather-bound books. Chen was standing in front of a cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace. The door was open, revealing not books but a small safe. A very good safe, Chen said, examining it with professional appreciation. Biometric lock. The kind that costs £15,000. The kind you don't install unless you have something valuable to protect. Can you open it? Aldridge asked. Chen smiled. Given enough time, I can open anything, but this one has something interesting. He pointed to a small screen on the safe's control panel. It's been opened recently. Last access was 72 hours ago, right before the Duchess left for Scotland. The safe took Chen 40 minutes to crack. 40 minutes of careful work with specialized equipment they'd brought for exactly this possibility. 40 minutes during which Aldridge stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the estate's parkland, thinking about duty and loyalty and how complicated the truth could be. When the safe door finally swung open, Chen stepped back and let Aldridge look inside. There were documents, legal papers, personal correspondence, a small leather case that looked like it might contain important jewelry, and underneath everything else, wrapped in soft velvet cloth, 3 items that made Aldridge's breath catch in his throat. A diamond and sapphire bracelet, a pearl necklace with a distinctive gold clasp shaped like intertwined roses, an emerald brooch set in platinum with an inscription on the back. Sergeant Mitchell was already pulling up the photographs from the vault inventory on her tablet. She compared them carefully with the pieces in front of them. It's a match, she said quietly. All 3 pieces. These are the items reported missing from the royal collection. These belong to the late Queen Mother. Aldridge stared at the jewelry. It was beautiful, certainly. The kind of pieces that museums would display behind thick glass. The kind of pieces that represented not just craftsmanship, but history. The Queen Mother had worn these. They'd been photographed on her at state functions and family gatherings. They'd been passed down through generations. And now they were here, hidden in a safe in the Duchess of Ashworth's private study. But something bothered Aldridge. Something didn't fit. If you were stealing valuable jewelry from the royal vault, why would you keep it? Why not sell it immediately? Why risk storing it where it could be discovered? Unless you weren't planning to sell it. Unless you had a different reason for taking it. He looked around the study more carefully. There were photographs on the desk. The Duchess with various dignitaries. The Duchess with charity workers. The Duchess with the King, both of them smiling at a garden party. And then, partially hidden behind the other frames, a smaller photograph. An old woman with kind eyes and an elegant bearing. The Duchess's grandmother, presumably. The woman who'd owned this estate before passing it down. Aldridge picked up the photograph and studied it. There was something familiar about the woman's face. Something he couldn't quite place. He turned to Mitchell. Can you run facial recognition on this? See if she's in any royal databases? Mitchell took the photo and pulled out her portable scanner. It took less than 2 minutes. The results came up on her screen and her eyes widened. Captain, she said slowly, this is Lady Catherine Ashworth. She was a lady-in-waiting to the late Queen Mother from 1952 to 1967. She was considered one of the Queen Mother's closest confidants. There are dozens of photographs of them together in the royal archives. The pieces started falling into place. Aldridge pulled out his phone and called Colonel Thornfield. He explained what they'd found and asked a specific question. When the Queen Mother died, were there any gifts listed in her will? Personal items she left to friends and staff? Thornfield was silent for a moment, then said he'd check and call back. The call came 15 minutes later. Yes, Thornfield said. The Queen Mother left several pieces of personal jewelry to close friends and staff, but they were never formally distributed. The family felt it was inappropriate to divide up her belongings so soon after her death, and then time passed and it was forgotten. The pieces were added to the general collection and inventoried with everything else. No one thought to actually execute the provisions of her will regarding personal gifts. Aldridge felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He asked one more question. Was Lady Catherine Ashworth on the list of people who were supposed to receive items? The pause on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know before Thornfield spoke. Yes, Thornfield said quietly. The Queen Mother left Lady Catherine Ashworth 3 pieces, a diamond and sapphire bracelet, A pearl necklace and an emerald brooch, the exact 3 items you just found. The room was completely silent. Mitchell and Chen and Webb all understood what this meant. The Duchess hadn't stolen the jewelry. She'd taken what was rightfully hers. What had been left to her grandmother but never delivered. What should have been given to Lady Catherine Ashworth 25 years ago, but had instead been locked away in a vault, forgotten, gathering dust while bureaucrats argued over protocols and procedures. The Duchess had found out about her grandmother's inheritance, probably while going through family papers or reviewing the Queen Mother's will, and she'd taken what should have been hers by right. The fake restoration business, the forged paperwork, all of it was to quietly recover what the royal family had failed to give her grandmother before she died. But here was the problem. However understandable her actions might be, however morally justified she might feel, she'd still broken the law. She'd falsified documents. She'd removed items from the royal vault without proper authorization. She'd created a fraudulent business to cover her tracks. Intent mattered, yes. But so did the rule of law. So did the protocols that governed how the royal collection was managed. You couldn't just decide that you deserved something and take it, even if you were technically right. That was theft. That was crime. That was exactly the kind of behavior that undermined the entire system of order and discipline that held society together. Aldridge stood there in the Duchess's study, surrounded by the evidence of her guilt and her innocence, and realized he was facing the most difficult decision of his career. He could report exactly what he'd found and let the system deal with it. The Duchess would be prosecuted. Her reputation would be destroyed. Her marriage to the king would become a scandal. The monarchy itself would be rocked by the revelation that one of its own had resorted to theft to recover family heirlooms. Or he could make this go away. He could take the jewelry, return it to the vault, and recommend that the investigation be closed due to lack of evidence. He could give the Duchess a chance to return the items anonymously and pretend none of this had ever happened. He could choose mercy over justice, pragmatism over principle. His team was watching him, waiting for orders, trusting him to make the right call. And the terrible truth was that Aldridge didn't know what the right call was. For 17 years, he'd operated in a world where right and wrong were clearly defined, where duty meant following orders and upholding the law and protecting the crown. But this situation was all gray areas and moral ambiguity. This was about a woman who'd been wronged by the very institution she'd married into, who'd taken matters into her own hands to correct an injustice, who'd broken rules to honor her grandmother's memory and claim what was rightfully hers. Was that theft? Or was that justice? Was she a criminal? Or was she someone who'd been forced into impossible choices by a system that didn't care about individual rights when they conflicted with institutional convenience? He thought about his own father, a police officer who'd spent 40 years serving his community with the same unwavering dedication that Aldridge brought to the Royal Guard. His father had told him once that the hardest part of the job wasn't dealing with criminals. It was dealing with good people who'd made bad choices. People who'd let desperation or anger or grief push them into doing things they'd never normally do. People who deserved compassion, but also needed to face consequences. The law couldn't bend for every sympathetic story, his father had said, but it could be applied with wisdom and humanity. That's what separated justice from revenge. Aldridge made his decision. He told Mitchell to document everything. Photograph the jewelry, the safe, the room, everything. He told Chen to make copies of all relevant documents. He told Webb to prepare a complete report of the search, including exact timestamps and chain of custody documentation. They would do this by the book. They would gather all the evidence. They would present it to Colonel Thornfield and let him take it up the chain of command. Because that's what duty required. That's what the rule of law demanded. But Aldridge would also include in his report the context. The full context. The history of the Queen Mother's will, the unfulfilled bequests, the fact that Lady Catherine Ashworth had died without receiving what had been left to her, the fact that the Duchess might have committed crimes to correct an injustice, but she'd committed them against a system that had already failed her family. He would present the truth, all of it, and let others make the hard decisions about what to do with it. That was the right answer, he realized. Not to choose between justice and mercy, but to provide complete information and trust that those in authority would make the wisest choice. He was a soldier, not a judge. His job was to gather evidence and protect the crown, not to determine guilt or innocence. That was what honor demanded. Not easy answers, but faithful service to principles larger than his own judgment. They finished their work by 7:30. The jewelry was secured in evidence bags properly documented, sealed with tamper-evident tape. The safe was relocked. The study was returned to exactly the state they'd found it. They walked through the house one final time, ensuring they'd left no trace of their presence. At 8 o'clock, as they were loading equipment into their vehicle, a car pulled up the drive. The housekeeper arriving for her daily duties. She waved at them cheerfully, assuming they were security personnel finishing up a routine inspection. They waved back and drove away, the Georgian Manor house receding in the rearview mirror. The drive back to London was quiet. Each member of the team lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered and what it meant. Aldridge stared out the window, watching the countryside give way to suburbs and then to the dense urban sprawl of the city. He was thinking about the Duchess, about what would happen to her when the evidence was presented, about whether she'd known the risk she was taking when she decided to claim her grandmother's inheritance, about whether she'd thought it was worth it. Colonel Thornfield was waiting for them at the palace. They delivered the evidence and the report. Thornfield listened without interruption as Aldridge explained everything they'd found and all the context that surrounded it. When Aldridge finished, Thornfield sat in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he thanked the team and dismissed everyone except Aldridge. When they were alone, Thornfield asked a single question. What would you do? If the decision was yours, what would you recommend? Aldridge chose his words carefully. He said that the Duchess had broken the law and should face consequences. But he also said that those consequences should be proportionate to the crime and should take into account the circumstances that led to it. The Queen Mother's will should have been executed properly. Lady Catherine Ashworth should have received her bequests. The system had failed. The Duchess had tried to correct that failure through illegal means, yes. But there was a moral logic to her actions that shouldn't be ignored. Perhaps, Aldridge suggested, there was a way to resolve this that upheld the rule of law without destroying a woman's life and destabilizing the monarchy. Perhaps the jewelry could be returned to the Duchess through proper channels, officially recognizing it as her grandmother's rightful inheritance. Perhaps charges could be avoided in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of what she'd done and a commitment to work within proper channels in the future. Perhaps this could be an opportunity for the institution to admit its failures and do better. Thornfield listened and nodded. He said that he would present everything to the king personally, along with Aldridge's recommendations. The final decision would rest with His Majesty. But Thornfield wanted Aldridge to know that he'd done exactly what needed to be done. He'd found the truth. He'd gathered evidence. He'd applied both law and wisdom to an impossible situation. That's what good soldiers do, Thornfield said. They don't just follow orders blindly. They think. They consider. They provide commanders with the information needed to make difficult decisions. You've served the crown well today, Captain. More than you know. 3 days later, Aldridge received word that the king had made his decision. The jewelry would be formally recognized as belonging to the Duchess through inheritance from her grandmother. The provisions of the Queen Mother's will regarding personal bequests would be reviewed and properly executed, even though decades had passed. The Duchess would receive a private reprimand for the methods she'd used to recover the items, but no criminal charges would be filed. In exchange, she would work with palace administration to establish clearer protocols for handling personal bequests and inheritance matters within the royal collection. It was, Aldridge thought, a wise solution. Not perfect, not simple, but wise. He never spoke to the Duchess about what had happened. He never received formal acknowledgement of his role in the investigation. That wasn't how these things worked. The entire operation remained classified, known only to a handful of people who understood the sensitivity of the situation. But 6 months later, Aldridge was promoted to major and given command of the palace's internal security division. And on his first day in his new office, he found a handwritten note waiting for him on his desk. It said simply, Thank you for seeing what others couldn't, for understanding that truth has many dimensions, for serving with both strength and wisdom. It was unsigned, but Aldridge knew who it was from. Looking back on that September morning on the drive through misty countryside, and the search of the Georgian manor house and the weight of decisions that could shape lives and institutions, Aldridge understood something profound about the nature of honor and duty. The easy path is to treat everything as black and white, right and wrong, legal and illegal. But the world doesn't work that way. Real honor isn't about mindlessly following rules. It's about understanding why rules exist, recognizing when they've failed, and working to uphold both the letter and the spirit of justice. Real duty isn't about blind obedience. It's about serving principles larger than yourself, even when those principles lead you into moral complexity and difficult choices. The Duchess of Ashworth had broken rules to honor her grandmother's memory and claim what was rightfully hers. Captain Aldridge had upheld his duty by finding the truth and presenting it with all its complexity and tact. The king had made a decision that balanced justice, mercy, and institutional integrity. None of them had taken the easy path. All of them had chosen to see the situation in its full dimensions rather than reducing it to simple categories. That's what separates those who merely wear the uniform from those who truly embody what it represents. That's what separates institutions that endure from those that collapse under the weight of their own rigidity. In the end, the story of the Royal Guard raid on the Duchess's estate wasn't about missing jewelry at all. It was about something far more valuable and far more rare. It was about the courage to seek truth even when it's complicated, the wisdom to apply rules with humanity and context, the integrity to serve institutions without becoming blind to their failures, and the understanding that real honor sometimes means standing in the gray areas, refusing to choose between imperfect options, and instead working to transform impossible situations into outcomes that uphold both justice and mercy. That's the lesson Captain Aldridge carried with him for the rest of his career. That's the standard he held himself and his subordinates to. And that's the kind of leadership that transforms good soldiers into great ones, that turns rigid institutions into adaptable ones, that makes it possible for ancient traditions to survive and thrive in a changing world. Not by refusing to change, not by blindly defending every rule and protocol, but by understanding that the deepest duty is to principles, not procedures, to justice, not just law, to truth in all its complexity, not comfortable simplicity. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I want to thank you. These are the kind of stories that matter, stories that remind us that real courage isn't always about dramatic action or clear-cut heroism. Sometimes it's about standing in uncertainty and still choosing to do what's right even when right isn't obvious. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about honor and duty and justice in new ways, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a situation where the right choice wasn't clear, where duty and compassion seemed to conflict? How did you navigate it? And if you want to hear more stories about the people who serve with honor even in impossible circumstances, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories to tell, more truths to explore, more lessons to learn from those who wear the uniform and carry the weight of difficult choices. Until next time, stand tall, think deeply, and never forget that real strength lies not in certainty, but in the courage to face complexity with integrity and tact.